Abrahamic religions were utilized as a weapon to destroy my people, to try to convert them, to try to break them.
What's Islam got to do with what happened to the people of South America? Because you said Muslims were enslaved and brought to South America, which means they were also victims. Under atheism, what's wrong with enslaving people?
Under atheism, what's wrong with enslaving people? I am an atheist, hardline atheist. And the reason why I'm an atheist here in this Western hemisphere, in this continent that the colonizers called America, and that has been America for 600 years, is because Abrahamic religions were utilized as a weapon to destroy my people, to try to convert them, to try to break them, and adding to the fact that a lot of the slaves that were brought here in the Atlantic slave trade were some of them were African Muslim. So you see that contention happening here in this continent. In the last 200 to 250 years after our process of independence between United States, Mexico, Caribbean, Central America, and South America, atheism has slowly grown bigger and bigger. Still, very strongly here, Catholicism and Christianity are very intertwined. However, atheism and agnostics have grown more and more, especially in the last 30, 40 years. We have seen an exponential growth of people abandoning Christianity, abandoning Islam, abandoning any form of religion once more knowledge of the impact that Abrahamic religions had as a weapons of mass destruction in our people had.
When you say weapons of mass destruction in your people, because you're generalizing a little bit, because you're talking about Abrahamic religions, but surely you mean Christianity came to South America, right?
Christianity, Catholicism, Islam, and Judaism. The four main ones were the main two ones that were utilized as weapons of mass destructions. Christianity and Catholicism being those two.
So the question I was asking, Dan, was because you generalized when you said that this applies to all Abrahamic religions, and I was just clarifying that that's not the case for your particular region, right?
It does, because eventually, as the permissions started happening, and Islam actually had a presence since early beginning, particularly with the Atlantic slave trade, because many of the slaves that were brought here through the Atlantic slave trade had or practiced Islam. We saw.
So Dan, I want to clarify. Sorry to interrupt you. It's one thing where Muslims were enslaved and brought to the region. I understand that. That's one thing. So there were Muslims from Africa who were enslaved and brought to South America. Okay, that I understand. But you're talking about Abrahamic faith being used as a weapon of mass destruction against the people to try and break them. And actually, it seems to me that you're referring specifically to Catholicism and Christianity, which are essentially the same. I mean, there's disagreements.
There's disagreements on that, but one of the main spears utilized was Christianity and Catholicism.
Yeah, I agree with
you. There had been a role within how, for example, Judaism and Islam came also to play a role into that. Albeit, yes, in a lesser mode sometimes. Sometimes one could argue that in an equal state as Christianity or Catholicism, that discussion of how much the other two main routes of Abrahamic religion played a role into the oppression of native North Americans, Central Americans, South Americans, or native Caribbean Americans. It had. In fact, I don't know if you're aware of a famous Taino leader. He was captured, and this is an interesting citation. He was reportedly captured after a revolt that happened in the Hispaniola. And, Hispaniola was the name utilized for modern day República Dominicana. And as before he was being burned in the stake, he turned to his Spaniard captors and he asked, "Do all the Spaniards go to heaven?" And the Spaniard responds, "Only the good ones." And he says, "Remind me to tell your God that I will go to hell before I lay eyes upon your brutes again."
Yeah, but I agree. So the thing is, there's a very moving tale. But what you seem to be doing, Brother Dan, is you're taking the experiences of your people that have had with the Catholic religion, the conquistadors, yeah, during the time of the Inquisition, where they were driving non-Catholics out of Spain, and they were then traveling in an end of the 1490s, and then Columbus took his ships and he was sailing around with Muslims who were, because they'd already sailed to these places and they had maps of these regions, which is why one of his ships was already leaking on the way. I mean, why would you have a new ship that was leaking? But the point here is that you're taking this experience with Catholicism and Christianity, and you're generalizing it to include Muslims, which didn't have anything to do with South America specifically. So I understand that because certain people of a certain religion treated your people badly would be a reason to look unfavorably at that, but it doesn't. I don't see why that would make you an atheist.
That's one of the major reasons. And well, in fact, regarding what you were stating there, Imran, if I may call you Imran,
Yeah, of course.
Is that there's no denying that the arrival of the four major branches of that, what can be construed as Abrahamic religions, did make their presences, as I said, yes, in majority, Christian and Catholics were savages here. They were completely and utterly genociders. They genocide for 500-600 years, but there were contributions and reaped the benefits of that from Judaism or Islam. But that's something that converses into how the whole colonization happened here. Now, going back to your point in this sense, one of the major factors that played, I declared myself as an atheist at the age of 8. I'm 42 right now, so just picture that.
Still a young guy, yeah.
Still a young guy, but getting there. Anyhow, being point is that, yeah, part of the understanding of the heritage of where I come from, of what my people had to go through. Immediately after I read the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, and all that stuff, I said to myself, why should I believe in gods that came here and utilized to conquer us? Hell no. I am not going to do that.
But Dan, that's the thing that I'm saying to you. That I understand the because what you're giving is an emotional reaction. No disrespect to attending down. I'm just having a conversation. Yeah, I respect you as an individual, and I wish you all the best in everything that you do. I'm just trying to have a conversation with you. So I understand that the emotionality of the terrible injustice that was done to the people of South America by the Catholics when they came and conquered and did terrible, terrible things. Similar things were done in Africa. To take resources, people were, given quotas of gold maybe or whatever resource they had, and if they didn't do it, people were mutilated or whatever. That sort of, I understand that. There's a lot of that is a very terrible legacy for any people to have, and the Catholics definitely have this legacy that they need to deal with. There's two things that are bothering. One is, why is that a reason not to believe in for God anyway? That's a second question. But the first question is, what's Islam got to do with what happened to the people of South America? Because you said Muslims were enslaved and brought to South America, which means they were also victims.
And it's a very interesting proposal that you give, and of course, by me explaining one of my major tenets as to why I reached and said, hell, I'm an atheist, I think that we need to analyze it in the following way. Number one, there is no objection that what happened in South, Central, and Caribbean, and then the North section of America, during those almost 600, well, 500 years, 450, 500 years of colonization and invasion, played and had a lot of role into how Western European had been developing as societies, as quote unquote civilizations, and how when they, by the mistake of that genocide of Columbus, realized, hey, guess what? We just discovered a new continent. They pretty much, shake their hands and said, okay, now we're rich, type of thing. And that notion, let's look at it from the basic evidence. Are you aware of what the discovery doctrine from the Catholic Church was?
Yeah. So once you find a land, you claim it in the name of God to be your own.
Well,
yeah.
That
and the other thing they said was that there was no people had a right to land, even if they were indigenous.
Exactly. So, yes. Now, going back to the question of how
the point with that, Dan, that's you're talking about Catholicism.
Catholicism, I know.
This is not Islam.
However, let me then give in that sense. Now, the presence of Islamic here, it became something that was carried alongside many of the slaves that were brought here from the get-go. So where were those slaves deposited? Mainly in coastal areas, and mainly near or by trying to eradicate native villages that were on those coastal areas. Now, there's an interesting effect that started happening between the slaves and the natives. One of those interesting things was, yes, there was mingling between both populations, and that's the origin of people like me who are Afro-Indigenous. That being said, there was also an interesting conflict happening within those areas. We have records where the cosmovision of indigenous directly conflicted with the cosmovision of enslaved people. And to work that out, that's when you start seeing the transformation of visions, etc. So suddenly you have a combination that started happening between Islam and native cosmogenesis or cosmovisions, and one tended to try to overtake the other one, or they assimilated between each other, or they adapted between each other. And as the decades passed, and as new generations came forward with that combination of indigenous and African with Muslim heritage, you start seeing the development of new ways, of new assimilations that sometimes worked to erase that nativeness from the whole thing.
So
Purposely or not.
Sure, I understand. But Dan, what you're saying is that what you're upset with is that the people who were forced to come over to South America, who were enslaved and brought there, they intermingled with the people and they lived there because they had no other choice. And this led to are you a religious purist? Do you believe that the South Americans are a specific ethnic group that should remain ethnically pure, and if other people come along, and if they are intermingling with them, assimilating or with them, that this is affecting them from a racial aspect? This is your perspective or not?
No, not at all.
Okay,
but really important, if I may, Imran, I think it's important that you acknowledge that when you're referring to America, to make that distinction between the North, Central, South, and Caribbean.
Yeah, I understand. I'm talking about South America.
I'm more into this.
Dan, can I ask you a question, Dan?
Sure.
Dan, you said you're a hard atheist, right?
Yes.
Do atheists do very bad things sometimes?
Yeah. Everybody does bad things at all times in that sense.
Does
However,
that make
the
atheism false?
condition of doing bad things is ultimately the decision and the capability of making a decision of each individual. However, when you add the justification of uh, of a of a religion towards that action, that's like the saying we have here. That's uh, adding insult to injury. You know.
Dan,
Do you,
you know,
do
you're talking about Catholicism again. Do you understand?
No, but I just
So
want to
what?
say to Dan,
Yeah.
basically, with that notion of religion dictating certain things, as Imran pointed out, that's to do with Catholicism. You do realize that being an atheist, there are certain implications when it comes to, for example, morality, right?
Not necessarily, because if we
Well,
learn one thing, is morality is human. Morality is not an abstract concept that only manifests through the religious belief. If we
no.
if we
So
do,
Dan, you're missing my point. The point that I'm trying to make to you is, since it is, from an atheistic point of view, a construct of human a capability and capacity, an individual who wants to go and therefore do bad things doesn't have to conform to any standards if he doesn't want to. He can effectively do whatever he likes, because under atheism, there is no God, there is no criteria to make anything objective. So under atheism, there are certain implications. And I'm not saying, by the way, that all atheists are immoral and unjust and unfair and all go out and do bad things. I'm not claiming that. I'm simply saying, for somebody who wants to go and do evil deeds, evil acts, he can use his atheist beliefs to reject the social consensus and the pressures that government places upon him or her, and say, well, if I'm simply a function of a primordial soup, a bacteria that multiplied and changed over time, then quite frankly, what does it matter if I do this or if I do that? Do you see my point, Dan?
I see your point,
So
and I would like to counter it.
what I'm trying to argue is, therefore, that doesn't necessarily therefore mean that atheism is disproved, that nobody should be atheist. It doesn't necessarily follow, does it?
Let me counter with the following way. If we part from the idea that the motivation of individual is selfish from the get-go, we can then argue that even with religion, that does not stop it. There's sufficient evidence in history where an individual decides to do that which we can call evil or bad or wrong, etc., or harmful, whichever of the synonyms you wish to use in that sense, and turn around and justify that action through their structure of belief, and justify through the well, God will forgive me type of thing, or it's in the plan of God type of thing. So fundamentally, if you're trying to say that atheism does not project or does not enable the possibility of having regulatory means to then say, okay, if you do this type of action, let's put it more simple. If you're gonna steal, right, and you steal that, you either are stealing it without harming anybody, or you're stealing it by harming somebody. Normally, those two are standardized options as to how somebody steals something. Okay? If you steal something without harming somebody, that tells us something of your decision. If you're stealing something by harming somebody, it also tells us something of your decision. What does it tell us? It tells us a mirage of options. It tells us that you took that decision. For example, if you stole it without harming anybody, you took that decision, because possibly you're hungry.
Yeah, but Dan, sorry to interrupt you. I know you give an example. There's a few issues here. First of all, I just want to, because I want to try and move, because we've been speaking to you for a bit of time. There's people waiting. I just want to try and maybe get to ahead. So every example you've given about wrong that made you go into atheism has been to do with Catholicism and not Islam. Okay. The only problem you raise with Islam is that the Muslim slaves that came from Africa to South America displaced some natives or integrated with some natives, which was I don't know why that is a problem, because you said that it doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. And the example and what you're trying to do now is maybe to explain why something is right or wrong. But under atheism, what's wrong with enslaving people?
Under atheism, what's wrong with enslaving people is the factual sense that we can determine in a very objective sense that when you are taking that liberty from that person, or describe that you're manifesting power over that person, you are subjecting that person to an aggression, if we could say it in that way.
I'm aggressively enslaving the people around me because I'm the chieftain and I have the power. No one can harm me. I'm an atheist, so there's no consequences for me doing right or wrong actions.
So
what is the reason under atheism to stop me?
Atheism isn't the lack of a morality. Atheism is the rejection of any form of pre-imposed a priori form of so-called morality. But that does not mean that we don't have elements that.
No, Dan, you're misunderstanding. Dan, let me just try, because I'm asking you why is it wrong under atheism to enslave people? What's the reason? Because look, survival of the fittest. If I can have more resources for my people, they can survive better. So I'm going to go to this neighboring tribe and I'm going to overtake them, take their women because it will increase our population. Get rid of the men because they're dangerous. I'm just going to take any resources they have, food, water, because it will improve my chances of survival. This is nature.
So
what's wrong with that?
Let me answer your question. Simply because atheism, like I said, is not a lack of morality. We can draw the conclusion by factual objective evidence that enslaving people creates conditions that do not benefit economically, social, politically, in any way, shape, form, or manner. Because hold on. Let me conclude this idea.
Sure. Okay.
Now, that being said, we can also derive on the fact that if you argue from a naturalist standpoint, it is also mute, because then you would have to accept that the social constructs that enable or give this sense of power over others is something that then becomes natural because we're human.
Yeah, but that's just a circular argument you've made. So the point here is that, of course, slavery is economically beneficial. I'm the chieftain. I've suddenly got extra wombs to have more, bring a bigger population. I've suddenly got now extra wealth because I've taken the wealth of this neighboring tribe. I've got extra resources. I've got access over greater land. Economically, this is much more beneficial for my system, for my tribe. This is just an economic prosperity. In fact, this was the motivation of the West when they went into these countries and they overtook them, and they did it for wealth and power. It's purely for wealth and power.
Let's make a distinction of Western European versus the West, because one thing is the Western Hemisphere and another thing is Western Europeans. They're two completely different things, even though we have that relational history. But let me bring that argument back. Point being is that, as I said again, You may say, okay, as a chieftain, I see an immediate economic benefit of slavery.
An
But
ongoing,
eventually, history has told us that that is not true. That the sustaining of slavery becomes economically unsustainable because of why? Because those people who are subjected to that power force will become rebellious.
No, let me help. Just go 1 second, please, Dan. So this is, I understand what you're saying, but actually this is not the reason why slavery became a problem. In fact, the reason that slavery was eliminated, because it was economically no longer the best way to go. They realized actually rather than having these people and housing them and feeding them and clothing them and treating them to keep them working in my fields, I'm going to say, look, you're all free. You can go. But they're going to say, but we haven't got any money to feed ourselves. We don't have any money to, be in a home. We don't have any money to treat our illnesses when we're unwell. Okay, you can come and work for me. I'm only going to pay you for the hours that you work. I'm not going to pay you for any breaks that you take and anything else. And this is exactly what they did. So then all of these people that they had previously been forking out money to keep enslaved were enslaved in another way, economically and financially. And this type continues even now. So I just want to ask you a question, Dan, because I think we've sort of been going around this. So do you agree with this statement? The black man is not better than the white man, and the white man is not better than the black man. Do you agree with this statement?
Yeah, of course I agree with that statement.
Let me give you another statement.
I wanted to go back to that point you made.
The Arab is not better than the non-Arab, and the non-Arab is not better than the Arab. Do you agree with that statement?
Come again.
The Arab is not better than the non-Arab, and the non-Arab is not better than the Arab.
Under the standards of modernity, of course we understand that.
Okay, those two
we can agree on that.
But Dan, those two statements were made over 1,400 years ago. Over 1,400 years ago, before all of the slavery that happened in South America. Do you know who made those statements?
Even if, Dan, let me give you
do you know who made those statements?
Please, enlighten me. I have an idea.
The Prophet Muhammad made those statements.
Mm-hmm. However. So
do you understand?
Making a statement.
Dan, 1 second. But you understand that as Muslims, we take our morality from our religion, i.e., the Creator and the Messenger that He sent has given us information on how to live in the world. Part of that information is that all human beings are equal in the sight of God, except for those who are more pious to Him, who are more God conscious of Him. And we were told specifically that you do not look down upon people because of X, Y, and Z. The other thing that happened was that in the old days, what people could do is they could enslave anybody. You're walking down the street, I'm just going to grab you, and yep, I'm stronger. You're going to work in my fields for the rest of your life. I'm walking along, and I see anyone could be enslaved all the time. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, came, he banned all avenues of enslaving people. All avenues of enslaving people. The only thing that remained simply was that if you are fighting a people in war and you capture them, then those people can be kept under servitude. So now we have a different paradigm, because you were talking about Catholicism. I'm bringing you specifically onto Islam. So Islam doesn't have the same concept as the Catholics do, and as the West generally does about slavery. We don't have the history of the West either, of the 85% of the millions and millions of slaves who died on trade routes in ships and were thrown overboard to save weight when they were being taken across the Atlantic. We don't have this history.